morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 46th Interarab Cambist Association Conference and Exhibition in Marrakech. It is my great pleasure to see all of you today, friendly faces, people we know, people who came from far away. And I'd like you to first give a round of applause to all the delegates who made it today. Thank you for being with us here in Marrakech. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not embarking on a conference, we're embarking on a 2-day journey at a moment where we have tremendous challenges for our businesses. Just remember 35 years ago, the great American poet Michael Douglas said, "Greed is good, greed is right, greed is what we want." And now all of you are chased by compliance officers, ethics officers, ESG officers. You cannot make a trade without speaking to someone who's going to check a box and who's 22 years old. So these are the issues at stake here. And we have an amazing lineup of panelists, thanks to the tremendous work that was done by the Moroccan Trading Floors Association and ICA over the last few months. You know that we will have experts, doers, thinkers, commentators, people who will enlighten the conversation and allow us to see with better clarity what's happening in this world of turmoil. So I will be the useless guy introducing people to the stage and giving their bios during those 2 days. So I'll expect you to be very gentle with me because basically I'm the concierge. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Reda Mkibarada for the welcoming words, President of l'Association Marocaine des Salles de Marché, the Moroccan Association of Trading Floors. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 46th Interarab Cambist Association Conference in Marrakech. It's my honor and privilege to open this event with a special acknowledgement of our distinguished guest. I extend a respectful welcome to Her Excellency, Madame Nadia Ftah Alawi, Minister of Economy and Finance, who will be present with us tomorrow. And also, I would like to express a warm thanks to His Excellency, Mr. Abdellatif Jouahri, Bank al Maghrib Governor, who unfortunately couldn't make it today due to a busy schedule, but for his invaluable help and his involvement in the success of this event. A heartfelt greeting for the Executive Committee of the ICA and the Association, the Moroccan Association of Trading Floors. Your collaboration in this event is fundamental and highly regarded. And to our honorable audience, your engagement and expertise are the driving force of this gathering. Welcome to each one of you to this vibrant city of Marrakech, a city where tradition and modernity, much like the spirit of our conference. Ladies and gentlemen, this year our theme is how to overcome market challenge and build a stronger tech-driven, sustainable future economy. Could not be more timely relevant. We stand at a crucial moment of our global financial journey. The rapid pace of technological advancement, coupled with unprecedented market challenges, calls for a bold reimagining of our economic model. Our discussions over the next few days will delve into a crucial question of how we, as a global financial community, can leverage technological innovation to not only navigate, but also thrive among these challenges. We will explore how sustainable practices can be more just an ideal. They are the foundation of a strong and enduring economy. We have the unique opportunity to shape a future where technology not only drives economic growth, but does so in a way that is environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive. This conference is a call to action, to think creatively, act collaboratively, and build an economic framework that can withstand and adapt to the complexity of our time. Our esteemed speakers, panelists, delegates, hailing from different corners of the globe, bring with them a wealth of knowledge and a myriad of perspectives. Their insight will be invaluable as we tackle these pressing issues and collectively envision a path forward that it is not only profitable, but also sustainable and inclusive. I'm particularly grateful to our sponsors, partners, and all dedicated individuals whose tireless effort has made this event possible. Your support not only reflects your commitment to the industry, but also to a collaborative future that benefits all. As we unfold the chapter of this conference, let us engage in a robust discussion, foster new relationships, and together contribute to shaping a resilient and a vibrant global trading community. Before I conclude, let's not forget the dinners awaiting us. In Marrakech, perhaps a good tagine is our receipt to digest our insightful discussion. Thank you, and look forward for a fruitful and inspiring conference.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you. It was an amazing speech. Ladies and gentlemen, you can only share my disappointment that I am not the governor of the central bank, as you know, obviously. But we will have our Minister of Finance tomorrow morning to give you a view of what's happening in your sector from Morocco. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome Mr. Tamer Khalifa, the chairman of the Interarab Cambist Association. Welcome to the floor, Mr. Khalifa. Please.
Assalamu alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to address you today. I would like to thank you, and on behalf of the ICA board and myself, for taking the time to join us for the 46th Inter-Arab Campus Association ICA Conference and Exhibition, which is being held in the fascinating city of Marrakech. We are deeply appreciative of the warm hospitality extended to us on our arrival. This year's conference brings together leaders and experts to discuss crucial issues facing the world economy today, with an overarching theme of how to overcome market challenges and build a stronger, tech-driven, sustainable future economy. The world economy has undergone significant changes since the COVID outbreak, with three mainstream trends prevailing recently, namely central banks' monetary tightening to bring inflation in check, digital transformation, and last but not least, the sustainability. I'm confident our notable speakers have valuable contributions on those fronts, and that all participants will walk away with worthwhile insights. Your deliberations in the conference can provide timely inputs and elaborations of the impact of emerging markets and the roadmap to weathering the profound and ongoing challenges. On another note, the term of the ICA Executive Committee draws to a close on the last day of this event, and a new committee will take the reins. Here I want to stop and acknowledge my colleagues. هطلع برا سياق البروفيشنال speech. I want to acknowledge my colleagues, أستاذ عقيل, أستاذ فيصل, and أستاذ إلي. And of course, احنا السيدة الفاضلة هنادي الغايبة عننا النهاردة. They have been working together with me for the past 8 years with a lot of problems that we have faced, a lot of challenges that we were in the venue. But alhamdulillah, احنا we came to an end, and inshallah الإيكا تسلم للnew committee by the end of this conference. On this occasion, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Executive Committee members for their meaningful efforts and support during our team together, and would like to thank the ICA community for the opportunity they have given to us to serve them. I'm sure the new committee will continue to endeavor to achieve the mission of the ICA. Last but not least, I'd like to thank the President of AMSM, Mr. Reda, and every member of the board for hosting our conference, and I commend the organizing team for all the efforts devoted in bringing about 500 delegates to this conference from around the globe. Additionally, gratitude goes to the participating banks and financial institutions for their sponsorships, exhibitors, and delegates. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and I look forward to engaging and enlightening experience that lies ahead in the coming 2 days, confident that we will harness the spirit of collaboration, innovation to make this conference another success story in the ICA track record. Now I declare the opening of the ICA 46 conference and exhibition open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to make a confession. This is the first time that we're setting up a conference and we're ahead of time. So that means that we have a room full of bankers, of people who are really used at waking up in the morning and being ready at the office very early in the morning. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, the tradition in this kind of conferences is to give you a global landscape of what's happening so you can address the issue of reducing complexity, understand better the geopolitical challenges. As you know, there are 2 major wars right now in the world that are happening and that are affecting our businesses. So for that, I would like to call to the floor the next panel who's going to start right now. I don't know if Zaid is ready, because we're trying to locate him. He's not a banker, so he's a little bit late sometimes. It happens. Zaid is ready. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Zaid Al-Basha Belbaji. Your own live for his next panel. I'll let him introduce his speakers.
Please, Ali, if you could join me, Miguel and Rachel. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Marrakech on this resplendent autumnal morning. It's a delight to have you with us. And what difference a week makes in politics. Just 7 days ago, like a paramedic administering CPR to a patient on life support, I was attempting to lift the 3rd day of a conference that had gone on slightly far too long. And today we have, by contrast, a veritable Grand Prix of economic fine minds to look at the future of the region and the economic outlook over the next year. So without further ado, we have Rachel Ziemba, the founder of Ziemba Outlook, Mikel Azevedo, Chief Investment Banker for Citi, and Dr. Alia Mobayed, Managing Director at Jenkins. You know the format. We've discussed it at length. We come here to discuss the region at a real critical juncture. Rachel, you and I, we discussed how the region is at a precipice. So I would invite you to provide your overview of the region each for 5 minutes. And given how you have so much to say, we will move to a conversational platform to discuss the issues that we're facing. So Rachel, please.
Thank you. Sorry, turned it off. Not a good way to start. Thank you, Zid. Thank you for all of you for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation and particularly engaging with Ali and Miguel and you. I think, I know we want in this panel to talk very much about the region, but I think I might start with the globe and the global economy, which I think is very much, as we said, sort of at a precipice, many competing trends. We have coming up those of us who write annual outlooks and the like, or want of picking years like 2024 and looking ahead and saying, well, how many people live in countries that are having elections? And there are quite a lot of them. Of course, whenever you have India facing an election, that kind of moves the needle. But coming from the United States, of course, there are many questions about how the political cycle in the US is already impacting the markets that we work in, including, I had figured that we might be here in Morocco and the US government might be at the precipice of shutting down and having impacts on the treasury market. Now, I think all of you know that a country, perhaps one that would maybe be smaller than the US, if you kept kicking the can down the road, you might face some more extensive fiscal impacts. There are other dynamics at play, but I think it just feeds into a point that I want to make, that going into this next year, US policy, economic policy, but especially foreign policy is set to remain quite reactive. Not only in this context of the wars going on, but if we look ahead into 2025 and beyond, we might also see further reactivity, in part, especially if there is a second Trump administration, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but a lot of question marks about sort of moving away from more professionally driven foreign policy and interagency process. We heard earlier about the challenges of compliance. Those are probably not going away. But I think one of the things the Biden administration has tried to do as they try to roll out more and more compliance expectations for businesses is at least be consistent in their application. You may not read it that way, but when I speak to them, they think they're doing that. So I think there's a lot of things going ahead. Now, I'm conscious of the nice timer ticking away. Just want to sort of leave you with sort of, two other quick points. One is just that we are living in a world in which global trade is increasingly being rerouted. In some ways, there was a dynamic before the COVID-19 pandemic where you had very integrated supply chains and businesses might have paid attention to all the points in their supply chains, but governments might not have, particularly in the US. Then there was a bit of a focus on sort of moving some of those supply chains out of countries like China and elsewhere. What we've seen as a result of things like the oil price cap, the sanctions on Russia, on Iran, on Venezuela, but also forced labor protection rules and the like, is that we've seen a move towards more intermediary trade, longer sea routes for transporting oil and gas, exacerbated by trends of developed countries not wanting to refine oil at home. Now that, of course, can provide challenges for businesses who have to pay for those alternate sort of trading systems, but it does also provide opportunities, particularly to some of those in this region that I think are looking to both new consumers, but also are looking to say, can we sort of be in between some of these blocks that are developing? Now, I think that's easier in some sectors than others. I think high technology, areas that many countries in this region, particularly in the Gulf, are trying to develop, that might be a sector that's more difficult to play between the blocks of the US and China. But there may be other elements in a world where there's a push for more technology transfer, where there's a push for more both sort of clean tech energy rollout, as well as full life cycle emissions tracking. I think there's some opportunities that we can get into. But the bottom line, I think, to leave you with, the rest of the panel will be talking about this as well, is that we are looking at an environment where interest rates are going to stay high, where that is probably going to be higher inflation than many of us are used to factoring in. Some of you come from countries that, of course, have already been factoring in higher rates and higher inflation. But this world where governments, not only in emerging economies, but also developed, are much more willing to get involved in supply chains, are much more willing to develop markets, I think leads to this sort of dynamic also where where businesses will have to pay much more attention to where their supply chains are and may have to segment and look for new partners. With that, I've way overstepped my time and look forward to what the rest of the panelists have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Miguel, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'll make basically 3 comments. One around debt markets, one around equity markets, and one around the region. So on the debt markets, I would say that what we are living now is a moment where we are separating the situations. Before, anyone rated in the B area could easily raise funds. Now it's actually not possible. It's not only an issue of pricing, it's an issue of the market not being open. And in the region, there's only a few countries with a B, but in an adjacent region, namely in Africa, this will create serious problems. It's already creating restructuring, there will be default and all that stuff. So that is a moment of forced clarity, which is, will be painful, But you know, we'll create hopefully a new platform to move from there. On the equity markets, we have seen significant corrections, particularly in growth stocks. That is actually, in my view, highly beneficial because we were in an area that was really not sustainable. We are now seeing corrections and valuations coming to a much more reasonable level, and I think that is highly beneficial. We believe that the markets will be open next year once we have a very clear view on the rates that have peaked. They may stay higher for longer, as they say, but at least we know what to expect. So I expect 24 to be a relatively good year in the equity capital markets. And my final opening comment would be around the region. With everything that has happened, with the creation of a bipolar world where Asia is growing, the western side of the world, meaning Europe and the US, is not growing so much. Clearly, the world is moving east, and who is in the middle in this new world? That's the Middle East. And you know, I'm based in Dubai. I work a lot in the Middle East, and you can see it's very different. The thinking, the atmosphere now from 5 years ago when I went there, and now everybody sees the Middle East as the center of the region, and the center means connecting with both sides, being neutral, establishing bridges, investing on both sides of the world. And I think this is actually very exciting for the region. And obviously, this comes at a moment where oil prices are high. So the region as a whole, in particular GCC more than MENA, is accumulating reserves and is using the financial power as a tool to exercise soft power also in geopolitics. We are seeing more and more and more investments in key companies around the world, and now we are even seeing not only investments but actually taking control. So it's really another way of asserting the power of the region. And as a final comment, I would say that over the last 3 or 4 years, I think the region to have been has been the Middle East, has been the most exciting region. And I hope it will stay like that for the next 5.
Thank you. As we all know, great excitement comes at great risk, often as well in personal circumstances. So we'll come back to that. And Dr. Alia.
No, first of all, sorry.
She's going to tell me not to call her doctor. This happens
Yes,
every time.
that's very important. No, first, I would like to also thank you for inviting me. This is my 3rd ICA time I'm in ICA, and it's great to see friends and familiar faces. But also being here in Morocco cannot but, and you asked me, Zaid, to reflect on sort of what we've heard from a few weeks ago, being here in Marrakech for very successful annual meetings that the Kingdom has organized. And in particular, you've asked me to focus on what the global backdrop means for emerging markets and our region in particular. So I'd like to maybe talk about 3 points, and the first one saying basically that obviously the key takeaway from the Marrakech meeting, myself working in the EM desk, is that the global backdrop continues to exert or pose significant challenges to emerging markets and to this region in particular. And these challenges are multiple. On the growth front, even though if we look at the beginning of the year, we've seen growth relatively globally remaining resilient. But what we have seen in the last few prints is that the slowdown is starting to sit in, with increasing concerns about Chinese growth that will obviously have significant impact on commodity exporters in our region, but also those countries that have been increasingly in emerging markets, increasing their interdependence into supply chains with China. So that these are some important risks to growth that we will continue to be with us. And we have seen, actually, even looking at the medium term, when you look at the World Economic Outlook that the IMF has just put out, this is the first time that we've seen a medium and long-term growth projections that are significantly below historical averages. And this will continue to raise important dilemmas for policymakers as they struggle with this inflation versus modest or low growth environment. In our region, obviously, also it was very daunting to see that growth forecasts for the regions have been downgraded from 5.6 to 2%, and that for many reasons: the oil cuts in oil exporters, the consistent inflation hitting middle-income classes with devaluation in Egypt, in Pakistan too, but also important climate-driven events that have affected North Africa, both in Morocco and Tunisia. And these will continue to weigh on growth. The other challenge is the financing challenge, as Rachel and Miguel just said. The financing challenge is one not only of lack of access to markets, but even for those who have access to markets, and we have seen that, those are obliged to issue, and we have seen it recently, even for IG names or relatively solid sovereigns that are increasingly issuing at higher interest rates. But more importantly, the financing challenge is exacerbating these vulnerabilities that are especially long-standing in our region, particularly where we have twin deficits in more than half of the region, at least in the oil importers, but also weighing on the corporates and the banking profitability, as we have been seeing most recently. But I think the main challenge remains in the medium term, in the short term to medium term, those also related to what we are seeing around us, the geopolitics and its impact on food prices, the Ukraine war, the supply chain disruptions, the Gaza war, and the great uncertainty that it will inflict upon us in terms of trying to think what are the future scenarios for the region. But I think climate risks are becoming more important. And again, I would like to quote some of the assessments that the IMF has done on the impact of climate change, that the impact on our region of increasing temperature by 1 to 2% is likely to shave off around 1 to 2 percentage point of GDP per annum. And that's quite significant, especially that many of our countries are struggling with that sustainability. So that takes me to the second point. So how we in the markets are looking at the region, and how are they pricing, institutional investors are pricing risk. I think what we are seeing is a continued divergence path, in the paths that many countries in the region are taking. I don't think that it is only about the tale of oil importers versus oil exporters that we used to have and listened to in the pre-pandemic era. I think more now the key dividing lines that directs and informs, I think, risk assessment on the sovereign level, at least, is really about the commitment to reforms, not only in terms of willingness to do reform, but also in terms of the ability to do these reforms. And this is why I would think that now, when I talk to institutional investors, and many of you are, I see that the investors are looking at the region by looking at maybe three categories. You have the transformative stories in the region, and I think we are today in Morocco in one of those transformative stories, and we can talk more about it later. And what I mean by transformative is that these countries have taken the effort to collectively, in their own societies, develop visions for development and growth for the future in the face of these important global changes and challenges that we just talked about. And those are Saudi Arabia, Morocco, UAE, and Oman. And these have been reflected in the rating that we have seen over the last few months. Oman has been upgraded. There are efforts to regain IG status both in Morocco and Oman. Obviously, the continued bolstering of the balance sheets in Saudi and UAE. But I think the second bucket is the one that is more where the markets are most focused. And these are really what we call the challenged but assisted countries. These are those countries that are grappling with debt sustainability, on the brink of potential default, but in my view, and we can discuss this, they won't default. These are high debt countries like Egypt, Pakistan, Tunisia, Jordan, and Bahrain. And despite the fact that they don't have access to markets, many of them have been able to mobilize resources, and we can discuss why and how. And the last is this bucket of very limited or sort of a bit reform story, where Kuwait can afford to because they have a lot of money. Iraq is in a very geopolitical difficult context, and Lebanon is really the worst in terms of its ability to get out of its crisis. So in my view, and there is all eyes in the next 12 months from our perspective sitting in the market will be on three critical countries in our space. These are Egypt, Pakistan, and Tunisia. As I meant, over the 12 months, not only do we have elections in Pakistan, we have elections in Tunisia and in Egypt in a few weeks' time that could change potentially dynamics, but also the crisis will put the policymakers, but also the private sectors in front of very important decisions to take and to work towards in the next period. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And I think in an era of high interest rates, we will all notice that Alia added a nice 20% to her time. Hopefully we won't be looking at 20% rates this year. Miguel, you mentioned how the region is the middle of the world. I want to talk about middle income in the Middle East, North Africa region, because they, for me, are very, very interesting. You and I discussed how when we discuss the region, it's an A to Z of economies. Please, let's discuss middle income and your outlook for those countries.
Yeah, definitely. Region, you go from A to Z, literally, right? I think what you have in mind is, in particular, Egypt, given its size, its importance, its history in the region. And it's a fascinating country, obviously the largest in the region. And it's in a very interesting situation. On one hand, I think, I am not a specialist in Egypt. I've been covering Egypt for 5 years, but I go every month to Cairo. And the entrepreneurial spirit that you see in Egypt these days, it's unbelievable. Whether it is tech, whether it is fintech, even in more traditional industries, there is an entrepreneurial spirit going around, and you have a lot of great stories. You also have some very public failures in the fintech space. That's normal. So that's great. You can see a lot happening, and you see the quality of the young graduates just leaving college and starting companies. The other day I met a company called PayMob. It's literally like this. They have just started a company off university, and it's a very successful one. But on the other end, you have very serious challenges, and I'll try to be brief here. So I would say there is a trade balance challenge. Usually it was energy, not so much these days, given the recent developments on the gas side, but definitely on agriculture, obviously exacerbated by the rising prices in wheat and others. So that's a big challenge, and that can only be addressed. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious with more production and a way of getting more production in the country. Then, so this one will take time, but I think it's relatively simple to see how to fix it. Then, what I would call a current account issue, which has to do primarily with money coming into the country. Before, you obviously had portfolio money or the carry trades. That's not happening so much anymore. But I wouldn't take that as a very big issue. What I think is really the big issue is FDI. You need much more FDI into Egypt. I think the underlying of the economics will support it. People are interested. But as the IMF says, and I will kind of sort of use the IMF words to protect myself as well, you need a level playing field in terms of investment. And everybody has to have the right terms, the same terms, and fair competition. Once that is solved, I actually believe Egypt can go back into a good role. So for the region, it's very important. And if you want, is one of those situations, as we were discussing, Pakistan, I'm a little less optimistic on Pakistan. I think there are more structural issues there. But I'm very confident that we will see Egypt back to where it was in 17, 18, after the devaluation where the economy took off. I'm confident that will happen.
Thank you, thank you. Alia, with regards to what Miguel was discussing, anyone who'd been at the IMF World Bank meetings a month ago would have thought it was a meetings about Egypt. Do you think there is a risk of contagion, or is it simply an example of how things can go really wrong in that kind of command economy, or do you see that having repercussions across the region, given the size of Egypt?
No doubt that the situation in Egypt is of concern not only for markets but also for Egypt's creditors, who have been instrumental in ensuring that Egypt remains in a muddle-through scenario rather than slips into, God forbid, a kind of crisis that no one wants. But certainly, I think this concern, and if we bring it today into the current geopolitical context of the region, in my view, will ensure that Egypt, working with its creditors, continuing and accelerating reforms, because Egypt has been doing reforms, it's just that these reforms are not enough, and also doing the right sequencing in order to gradually float the currency and make, while continuing the structural reform necessary to bring competitiveness, should, in my view, ensure that we have a smooth transition. But the problem today remains that, and we have to say it, that this is a country that every 12 months at least requires $30 billion of external financing. FDI has been performing very well, helped by the process of asset sales that the government has started and is committed on. Even though if this asset sale program is more focused, or the approach to it is more from a financing perspective rather than mainly from a private sector investment and growth perspective, but it is delivering. So I think FDI will be able to help, but I think at the end of the day, you need also growth, and the key structural impediment for Egypt's going out of its debt trap, I would say, is to ensure that growth is private sector led. Over the last 8 to 10 years, we have seen private investment in Egypt consistently falling, while public investment has been the key drivers of growth. And for us, and I think many of the private investments that are in this room, to feel confident to put back and multiply and continue to invest, all these structural reforms that the government has very well put to so far would require, as Miguel said, a level playing field and a more basically competitive exchange rate. These are two essential elements. The political economy of both reforms is a difficult one. but I don't think there is any escape from it.
Do you think, given what's going on, that it will be more interesting for investors to look elsewhere in the region, or do you think they'll continue simply to look at the good stories as you discuss them? Because in some of the labeled bad stories, there's some real opportunities for investors.
Yeah, I mean, it depends if you're talking about bond investors. Obviously, bond, and here depends on the risk appetite, but we have been seeing consistent, for example, tightening of spreads, as I mentioned, in Oman, which has been a story that has delivered in terms of bringing its debt from 60% to 30% over the last 2 years of GDP. This is a reflection of the commitment and delivery on reform. There is interest a lot in also Morocco, and this has also been reflective in spread. The problem in Morocco is that there's not enough debt. Not that you should issue debt. Actually, we commend the Ministry of Finance for its very strategic and debt management approach in trying to both mobilize resources from the international financial community, and I mean Morocco getting to get an FCL this year from the IMF is a very strong signature and signal of the credibility of its policy framework and institutional framework. But investors, I think, that are beyond the bond markets are looking for growth stories. And we have seen, for example, in Morocco, the growth in the energy sector, for example, the renewables story. This is very important one. And financial inclusion is driving a lot of the investment in the financial sector. These continue in Egypt, in Morocco, and in Iraq, for example. So depending on which type of investors you're talking about, I think the region is still providing a lot of opportunities, particularly in those sectors.
It was principally with regards to sovereign products, which we've discussed, and like the debt you mentioned, and also sovereign investors. I'm very interested to know whether sovereign investors should be investing in the region rather than outside. And Miguel, please.
I was just going to make 2 comments. One is, and I don't want to make this an Egypt conversation only, right? But
it's a big country.
But on FDI, as it was said, it has been primarily secondary, i.e. buying stakes in existing companies, rather than primary, i.e. creating new projects, new jobs. And Egypt, as a short-term FX issue, but as a long-term job creation issue, which is far more difficult to deal with. So that's one. And the second is, and I'm going to be a little controversial here, but it's what I see. Right now, from an equity standpoint, Egypt is not a place where investors are willing to put money right now. They see the growth, they see the entrepreneurial capacity, they see the value creation opportunity, but they also see a lot of uncertainties in the short term. So everybody is holding off. And there are incredible companies in Egypt that need to raise money to keep growing and to diversify away from Egypt. That the only reason why they cannot do an IPO, say, in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or even Saudi, because some of them do have operations in Saudi, is because of this uncertainty. But once we get to a new level, and people believe this is a new level, I mean, of FX and sort of the governance around the whole economic activity, I think money will come back in, and these companies will be champions in the region, because what you see there is quite amazing.
We'll come back to money coming back in when we move to green financing. Rachel, it's 31 degrees in late November in Marrakech. Climate change isn't just knocking at the door, it's breaking an entry. The Arab world has heated more since 1980 than the rest of the world has since 1840. I believe, the end of water is more of a concern than the end of oil. I think Egypt's economic circumstances are not helped by the climate situation. It's only going to get worse. I'm a strong believer that this is going to regulate certain geopolitical dilemmas way before the politicians do. How do you see that affecting the region? And then we'll perhaps speak about infrastructure.
Before I do that, I just wanted to pick up on some great points that Ali and Miguel have made, and also yours on this question of sovereign investors of the region investing in the region, because I do think a trend that's happened has been an increasing shift. Now, in some cases, that is probably skewed when we look at the data about a shift in how Saudi Arabia invests, which includes a lot more of the sort of assets being developed by the Public Investment Fund and investing in Saudi Arabia, and so other dynamics. But there's been this trend over the last 5 years. Maybe one of the things that helps drive this enthusiasm and interest that Miguel was highlighting, which has been this shift of more strategic funds. So instead of the old days where it was the oil wealth comes in, it gets put in sort of lower yield, maybe not always lower yielding, but assets abroad, sort of equities and bonds, really sort of taking on equity stakes at home and elsewhere. And we've seen sort of increased also investments in some of these countries that need this capital flowing in. I think the issue, though, is both the amount that's needed, but also this issue that sovereign investors, too, want to see capital returns. They might have a long-term horizon. There might also be a political stability. There might be other interests at play. But one of the reasons that we've seen this alignment between both the more investment-oriented arms of, say, of Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia within Egypt, within other partners in the region, with the IMF and calling for this playing field, is that they would like to see economic returns in that context. So I think there's been this shift, and it is partly driven by those environmental realities that you talked about. So I got back to your question.
On that point, the IMF says the Arab world needs 3 times what the rest of the world needs to mitigate climate change. It's huge.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's
3.3% of GDP.
Exactly, and so that's why it's good that we are seeing capital from the region invested in solar, a little bit less in wind. I mean, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. Plus, there's also question marks, especially when you're talking about the energy producers, of how much of it is a story of producing, sort of decarbonizing at home, at least in part, or at least decarbonizing the power sector in order to export more fossil fuels while there's an opportunity to. And I will note one of the things that's interesting, and I may be corrected by others on the panel, but a lot of the equity issuance that's had the most interest, particularly out of the Gulf, has been upstream and downstream energy spinoffs. I'm maybe being a little bit unfair there. So, I mean, look, I think what's clear is there's a problem, there is an investment opportunity, there's been a move, but it's slow, it's sort of a need to catch up. And that's why I think sort of sitting in the US, there's been a lot of criticism of the COP that's about to start. There's a lot of criticism of having, I hope it's clear from my framing that I think this is unfair criticism. There's a lot of sort of questions of why should someone be both the head of sort of sort of a decarbonizing process, sort of a climate change process, and also the head of a major national oil company. And I think the answer is that already there is a recognition in the Arab world that there needs to be more, that this is a real problem. I mean, I think water supply definitely is a contributor to not only financial challenges but conflict. I mean, we see that very palpably in the in the region as well. How do we capitalize more? I think some of it is is sort of directing funds, perhaps even from local governments towards some of the points in the infrastructure cycle that are hardest to get started. And then I think some of it is putting more funds behind some of these projects, whether it's out of the IFC, out of other sort of platforms, and some of it is not only projects to address these issues in the Arab world, but also catalyzing investments in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere that, if anything, also needs further funds. I know I'm coming up with different platitudes. So I think
Yeah.
there's a recognition this is a problem, but there needs to be even more allocated.
We have recognition that it's a problem. Miguel, are your clients recognizing that this is an investment opportunity? How do you see the appetite for green financing across the region? How much of it is coming from the region? Are your clients even interested in this space?
Yes. So let me use a few examples. And I will start with that, and then I will go into equity, because it's also very relevant in equity. So on the debt side, if you are in an industry that is highly pollutant, showing that you're doing steps in the right direction is very important. I'll give you an example. A few years back, 12 months back, we worked on a transaction, a Eurobond transaction for an upstream oil and gas company. And they were doing their own ESG rating. And when we start getting feedback from investors, we actually got, someone saying, if you get a B rating, I will invest 100 million at 8%. If you get less than B, we will invest 50 million at 9%. So a clear link between the ESG rating and the rates. But this is an oil and gas company. Another more recent example, which is an hospitality company in Dubai, they, and they use all the sort of renewables, they use waste management. So it's actually quite an interesting story in the hospitality sector. They got an A rating for ESG. I wouldn't say anyone bought the bonds because of that, but it created a very positive story around the bonds, that you're doing all these great things, and on top of it, you are actually doing it in the best possible way. So it's very important in terms of attracting interest. On the equity side, I would just say a few words. Over the last 18 months or so, we have seen a lot of IPOs in the Middle East in general and in the UAE in particular. In all those IPOs, whether those are oil and gas related subsidiaries of ADNOC in Abu Dhabi, or those are utilities in Dubai, roughly speaking, that's what has been happening. On a roadshow presentation of 25 pages, I would say that on average 5 are on ESG. That's quite a lot. And investors will inquire you. Obviously, greenwashing is a big thing. So you have to have a strategy. You have to have commitments out there. It doesn't saying, net zero by 2050, no one takes that as serious anymore. You have to show what are you doing. And we did one transaction last year in Dubai for DEWA, which is the local power and water utility. And they came out with very specific targets. And that really, really increased the interest in the stock. So definitely very, very key to attract interest. In terms of, on the other side, the region as an investor in green financing, definitely. I think the region is actually very, very concerned about it and is trying to do the best they can. So definitely very important. I wouldn't say it's the only factor.
Yes, yes. From the perspective of infrastructure investment, Rachel, you will note the recent moves to meet the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative with the US Partnership for Infrastructure. If you read between the lines of what's going on currently in the Middle East, I see a lot of it with regional countries, regional powers not wanting to harm their future from the perspective of the US Partnership for Infrastructure. How late in the game do you think the US Partnership for Infrastructure is? And I don't want to say elephant in the room, but the dragon in the room being China. Where do you see its role in these investments? As we know, Chinese investments have sometimes been very difficult for sovereign states to meet. And I don't know if you saw the piece in the New York Times yesterday about the decoupling of the Chinese and the American economies. The old model of China saving, the US spending, China lending, the US borrowing is slowly coming to an end because the countries are going in different trajectories. So China has a role in this region, a varying one whether you look at the Gulf or North Africa. And what are your views on this, please?
So to start with your point of, how late in the game is the U.S. and to some extent quite late, I think it's not only a story of when, it's a story of how much and in what ways. I mean, we did finally see sort of the G7 coming out with partnerships and sort of investing, not only several years after, but there's not been too many projects. Now, some of this is also back to the point, sort of earlier of what phase in a project can government catalyzing private sector investment have the most benefit. Because, continue to hear sometimes it's sustainability and feasibility studies where that sort of comes in. I mean, a couple of things have happened, I think, at the sort of over the same trajectory, which tie into your decoupling point. One is that actually Chinese outbound investment to Belt and Road projects has fallen fairly dramatically over the last several years. That's partly a function of Chinese surplus moving in sort of different directions. It's partly a reflection of something that I'm sure will come up over the course of the day and in Reza's talk about debt restructuring, but that some of the countries where there were sizable BRI projects have gotten themselves into a position where they need what have been sort of long-standing debt workout processes, and there's still rules sort of developing there. On the decoupling point, I think what's interesting, I didn't see the New York Times piece.
It's very good.
Probably, I will take a look at it. But I've seen some other ones. I think I was probably on the airplane at the time. But one of the things that's happening is, it's back to this point of the redirection of trade and indirect sort of, points, which is there is a lot lower, not dollar values, but percentage of trade direct from the US to China. What hasn't changed is that a lot of the surplus of goods that are produced, the sort of external surpluses produced in Asia, are still consumed in the United States. So one of the things that's been happening because of US tariffs and other things like that is and even things like COVID lockdowns in China, you had a lot of companies engaging in China plus one strategy. So they opened up a factory in Vietnam or Malaysia, and I'm sorry about the the volume here. But when you then unpack, so Vietnam is now exporting more to the US than it did 5 years ago. But when you unpack where is Vietnam getting its inputs from, they're coming from China. So that's not to say that there aren't new opportunities and new sectors being developed, but it also just goes to show that if a policymaker has a goal in the US, and sometimes they have, of import less from China and redirect trade and sort of buy less, sometimes you may not be solving all of those problems. It's if there's underlying fundamental drivers. Now, on the Treasury side and financing the US deficit, I think there's an interesting point we've been seeing, both from Chinese purchases, but also from those in the region. And I get a lot of questions of, are the Gulf sovereign funds investing less in the US? And they are investing a bit less, in part my argument of they're investing more at home, more in the region, but they're also buying different things. Some it's like they're buying equities. Some cases, like especially where China and some of the Gulf funds are concerned, they're buying agency bonds. They're buying asset-backed sort of securities, which still, then maybe you have other private sector actors buying the US Treasury. So clearly there has been elements of, if not decoupling, de-risking. My take on the sort of long-awaited Biden-Xi visit of, was it yesterday or the day before, was an element, the meeting was the message. They're talking again. It's a good thing when superpowers talk. It's a good thing for business when leaders talk, because one of the biggest challenges, both that those in the Arab world, but also those throughout the world, has been that you have sort of new government involvements and new key supply chains with a lack of clarity about where the direction of travel is. Alia mentioned earlier that one of the important things is commitment to actually delivering on reforms.
Yep.
And I think having those messages and signals is very important, either to sort of make it clear, here's a sector that's off limits, because no investor wants to go where they're not wanted, but also to make it clear that the policies are going to back it up.
Yep.
And just to circle back, I've spent my time, but to circle back to your point about driving the sort of economic returns on environmental related projects, One of the most important reforms, I think, in sort of setting that tone from a government perspective has been changes in taxation, changes in energy costs, and we've seen more of that in the Gulf maybe than other parts of the region. So I think that clarity there, and so ultimately this is a story where certain sectors are probably, and infrastructure projects are probably going to be open to both Chinese capital and US capital. There's going to be others, especially when we look at the highest sort of tech-enabled projects, that I think are probably going to have to pick and choose. And I think that's going to be an important test of this new entente and communication between the US and China. And I'm particularly sort of watching, one of the things that's really relevant for this region is that I see early signs that the concern about state investment in the US that was directed towards China a couple of years ago is starting to sort of affect and raise some questions about sovereign investment from the Arab world. It's early days, but I think it's something that will be very important to sort of almost over-communicate about, especially in technology sectors.
Yeah. I was very interested to see that you didn't think that the lessening commitment in the Belt and Road was due to China slowing down. It's due to other concerns. I found that very interesting.
No, I was being overly technical in talking about their less surplus. In part, they're changing surplus as a function of them slowing down and directing more capital. But I think there is also, I think there's sending dynamics and as well as receiving dynamics. They do want financial returns on these projects. And sometimes when you know, any boom, right, you can have investments go out and not all of them play out.
Yes.
I think there's definitely been a certain degree of buyer's remorse.
Thank you. Miguel, just on what Rachel said, if you could help answer.
Just two comments here. One is, a few years back, people used to say, this is not my sentence, but I really find it very funny and accurate. People say, okay, Western investors come, and this was more in the context of, it was more Africa than, actually China and Belt and Road is not so relevant in our region, but in Africa, for example, is extremely relevant. And the Western investors would come with a checklist. Boom, 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 and guess what? If you don't meet the checklist, there's no investment. The Chinese would come with a checkbook, and they would deploy the money without a checklist. Now we are in the opposite situation where, you know, people realize that the checklist is not that bad, actually, because it guarantees that you do only certain things. And the checkbook turns out to be very expensive, because it's time to give money back. And roughly 2 months ago or so, there was kind of a Paris Club meeting between China and its own creditors. And a lot of creditors, and I know a few of them, were expecting a rollover, kicking the can down the road, and the answer was, not really. We want the money back. There is one country that FX went down 40% for the simple reason that all the dollars available were channeled into China to pay for that debt. So it's now very clear that Belt and Road is not a free option. I would make just one final comment here in the region. What I see is actually a little bit the opposite, is the GCC countries, primarily UAE and Saudi, actually investing in China, creating captive markets. Very true, the same thing for India, because those are the two big markets for oil in the future. And so there's actually more money flowing from the region into China than the other way around. And for a very solid and very real reason, which is creating captive markets for the oil in the future. So, you know, Belt and Road is interesting. I think is a little bit part of history now.
Thank you very much. On the subject of FDI, the oil exporters are also hugely dependent upon FDI to realize their ambitions and plans. Miguel, we discussed this on the phone yesterday with the large infrastructure giga projects in Saudi. Dr. Alia, where do you see that investment coming from? Because in many cases, the investment needed is almost unrealistic. And if there is waning appetite to have China invest, given the conditions and the checkbook that Miguel described, where's this money going to come from? I'm of the personal opinion that a lot of these projects are not going to be able to be realized or are too late in the game. And there'll be far too much competition, for example, from the likes of the Noor project in Morocco for other countries to even get that close. Please, I'd love to know your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there is no doubt that Gulf countries are on this spending spree and still in this logic of biggest, tallest. But at the same time, I think the difference compared to what we used to see from a decade ago is that many of these investments are actually in line with their own vision of where do they want to see their development. And that is clearly moving towards reducing the dependence on oil on the one hand, but also ensuring that they are creating jobs for their own for their own youth, and that is particularly the main concern in Saudi Arabia. So a lot of these investments so far, the funding of it has been also coming domestically. I mean, if you look at the Saudi budget, at also the lending in many of the Saudi banks, and I'm sure maybe there are some people here that can contradict or complement what we're seeing, is that a lot of this funding has come domestically from domestic liquidity, which has been ample in the domestic banking system and through the surpluses that the Saudi government has been accumulating both at the PIF and at SAMA. Now, obviously, the ambitions are much bigger than the resources available, and this is where there is a need for an FDI to come forth. So far, the FDI target is not met yet. I mean, there's quite an ambitious target for the 2030, but if we look at the annual level, FDI in Saudi is underperforming. We are seeing much more FDI coming into the UAE. But I think also the kind of legal reforms that we are seeing in Saudi, the increase in private sector investment, the opening up even further of the equity rules for the equity markets is bringing in the funding. So I don't think it is, I mean, Saudi will face a constraint, but obviously it is putting the incentives for foreign investors, and that is costing the Saudi budget quite a bit in terms of foregone taxes, etc., to entice foreign investors to come to Saudi and therefore crowding it out from other places. But again, I think when you look around in emerging markets, I think the value proposition, again, of investing in renewables across the region is a huge, and there will always be private sector flows coming, as we have been seeing in Morocco, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can confirm that to us. The second thing is that also a lot of the investment flows that are coming are being complemented by guarantees and by support of multilateral agencies or co-funding, like IFC is co-funding a lot of the projects in many sectors, including in the Gulf. EBRD is chipping in across the southern Mediterranean. So yes, FDI has been important and will continue to be important, but I think when this is underperforming, the countries are resorting both to domestic resources that are ample in the Gulf and to complementing financing through multilateral and regional development.
And the re-emergence of the state, the appropriation of state assets under one, these things are happening to generate wealth. Miguel, are you positive for 2024 to wrap up? I mean, what are your views? You positive, negative, indifferent?
No, you're
You
always
excited
positive.
you excited for your bonus?
You're always positive when you are in these conferences. You always find a way of putting a positive spin. But that aside, I think we've been through 2 very difficult years. I think the rate hiking cycle is close to an end. Inflation is about to be tamed. Geopolitics aside, obviously we have some clouds in that area. But that aside, I think this will be a great year, 24. And in the region in particular, in the GCC, I think this will carry on being a great moment to be there.
Yeah.
Most exciting region in the world to be in
Yes.
particular in my business, but in many others. And I'm also hopeful that Egypt, which is the big question mark in the region, will find a way post-elections to go back to financial stability. And as I said, the opportunities there are immense. We just need to find the capital to meet and fuel the opportunities.
Well, let's hope these places stay cool enough for us to continue doing business there. And Rachel,
It's raining.
It's raining
like
in
hell
Egypt.
in Dubai. I don't know if
Okay.
you've seen pictures.
Thank
of
God for
Dubai is flooded today.
Thank God for cloud seeding. Rachel, what are your views for 2024?
Sorry.
You'd be-
Hopefully,
you'd be- you'd be-
hopefully it won't be as volatile as my ability to use this microphone. But look, I think I'm a little more cautious than Miguel. I think we're going in, but I do think this broader point of companies have already kind of struggled and thought through what the costs of, say, getting bridge financing looks like. There's been a bit of a repricing of certain projects. I think there's a little bit more predictability. I see this sort of, the 2024, I think, is going to be a year of a bit more slowdown in the U.S. economy. I think there's going to be some clouds in the region, in part because of the lagged impact of sort of reduction in fossil fuel output. That being said, I think there is an opportunity for some of these other sort of more long-term drivers to sort of come to the fore. Yes. So I think it'll be a decent year. I think that often in the marketplace, people get too worried about, does country X have recession or not recession? And I think more that this will be one of those years of navigating towards what are the right pricing for some of these long-term trends. So I guess it's a cautious optimism, but that this is really sort of a year where we'll really see whether people can sort of what the impacts of this rising debt service cost for sovereigns is manifesting, and hope that they can navigate it.
Dr. Ali, in 60 seconds, your outlooks for the year.
I mean, look, we are at the cusp of an important turn for us working in emerging market. Of course, consensus is that the Fed is at the end of the there is no more hikes. But if we look at pricing, we're seeing even markets pricing cuts as soon as in May. This is quite important. I think markets are even ahead of the policy announcement. You have seen this week how markets have looked at the data and what CPI has said and gave less importance to what Chairman Powell said few days before. This means that with outflows from EM funds starting to decline, and that's a very good thing, what we are going to look out for is to see this turn get into the positive territory. We have light positioning in general in emerging markets, and with a limited supply, because a lot of the EM countries are going to continue to be limited in terms of their ability to to access market. So we remain very positive EM credit in the period ahead, despite a lot of volatility that is going to come from the fact that 40% of the population next year is going to vote.
Yes, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think having this meeting here is so pertinent, given that Morocco has absorbed the painful reforms that were needed and now is seeing the elements of that success. And I think it's really very much the poster boy of a country with very few natural resources that's been able to kind of transform itself to be able to do this. And, 2 months after a major earthquake, I think the success speaks for itself. Strong leadership, a fair market, and important large infrastructure and renewable opportunities have really paid dividends and hopefully will continue to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much, and thank you to ICA for arranging this event. Thank you.
Picture. Ladies and gentlemen, don't leave the room because we have to do some house management together. So I just keep you for 3 minutes right after the picture of this amazing first panel led by this icon of style who's Zaid Belbeji, the Basha. Thank you very much for stewarding this conversation. And right after this picture, I'll just share with you 2 or 3 things for house management and how we're going to embark on the rest of the journey. Another round of applause for our panelists, please, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you, man. Thank you. Appreciate it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, but every time I watch the Academy Award, I see, people who receive the Oscar, they look so shocked, but then they reach out to their pocket and they read the speech that is already prepared. So, as you know, there is no pure love. There are only proof of love, so I'd like to acknowledge all the sponsors who enabled us to have this conference today. So I will quote all of them. Of course, IMSM, l'Association Marocaine des Salles de Marché, the Moroccan Association for Trading Rooms, Attijari Wafa Bank, Banque Populaire, Bank of Africa, Crédit Agricole du Maroc, FAB, Murex, Bank ABC, Crédit du Maroc, CIH Bank, Finastra, Integral, LSEG, and Société Générale. If you can give them a round of applause because they've been instrumental. I'd like also to acknowledge the leadership team and the management team who made all of this possible and worked relentlessly throughout the 3 last months. Mohamed Filali, Rita Al-Haj, and of course Malika Benjeloun, and all the people that were involved into making this event a success. Last point before we all go to a much deserved coffee break and before the next panel, which is going to be about carbon and carbon markets, and I know this topic is so exciting for all of you. So ladies and gentlemen, please, a lot of you have registered for the excursion on Sunday. And all of you are great professionals and you know that money is very important. If you think you're going to drink too much mint tea on Saturday night, and you will not wake up on Sunday morning, please go to the front desk and tell them that you are not going, because this amazing excursion in the Moroccan Medina and in the iconic place, which is a UNESCO landscape place, Jamal Fna, needs time, money, and guides. So please make sure if you don't go there that you mention it, even though you're registered. It's okay. Nobody's going to blame you. You can drop out if you don't want to go. So, ladies and gentlemen, see you in half an hour sharp, because the only power that I have is to keep time in this panel. And let's get ready for an amazing carbon discussion in 30 minutes. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, and a few enemies, I'm so happy to have you back again in this room for an amazing conversation about carbon. And I'd like, before introducing the panel, to give you a little bit of house management and just one idea. If you guys want to compensate the carbon journey, I do accept wire transfers, major credit cards, and cash if you don't have this. So I'm ready and I can take the subscriptions at the end. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Paula van Lanningham, Director of Carbon Research, LSEG, who's going to moderate this amazing panel. Paula, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome my panel onto the stage now, and as they take their seats, I will introduce them to the group as well. So we have a variety of different representatives from aspects of the carbon markets here today. So first we have Dr. Nazim Poor at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, where she leads the Carbon Market Innovation Initiative at the Center for Nature and Climate. She also leads the carbon dioxide removal sector at the First Movers Coalition. Please. We also have Naufal Alami, who is the Global Head of Commodities and Energy Transition Trading at First Abu Dhabi Bank, where he manages a wide portfolio, including oil, carbon, and metals. So please come on. And last but not least, we also have Fazil Abdul Rahimin, who is the Group Vice President of Sustainability and Climate Change at TACA. He has quite an extensive experience leading a variety of different carbon projects across carbon accounting and climate risk assessment. So thank you all very much. Oops, dropped my pen. So as I said before, my name is Paula van Lanningham. I am the Director of Carbon Research at the London Stock Exchange Group. What we are going to do today is talk a little bit about different carbon markets. I think when we talk about carbon markets, we often talk about them in a very general sense. But the reality is we are talking about a wide variety of different types of markets. Not only do they straddle the line between securities and commodities, and different groups treat them differently, they are also different types of markets. So you have voluntary markets, which are the ones that people hear a lot about right now. You also have compliance and regulatory schemes. You have allowances, where every allowance looks like every other allowance, and then you have credits, which are very different depending on the individual attributes of the project. All of these are fairly critical pieces of the larger conversation around carbon markets and climate change. And they all have quite a large variety of fairly specific terminology that we use within the carbon markets. We've taken a vow as a panel before this to try and avoid using too many carbon-specific terms, but there are a couple that are particularly unavoidable. So we will probably talk a bit about Article 6, which is the article from the Paris Climate Agreement that talks about global carbon markets, as well as the concept of additionality, which is the idea that a carbon project needs the financing from credits in order to exist. It's a key component of voluntary carbon markets and a big part of the controversy that has recently been underlying the discussion. And then we will also probably refer a bit to permanence, which is the length of time that the carbon can be guaranteed to remain outside of the atmosphere. So nature-based projects, for example, often face questions about the length of permanence, particularly in a changing climate, and that is often a source of controversy within this space. If we do get a little bit too in the weeds with the acronyms, we will try and pull back as well. But then if you do have any questions, we will all be happy to answer any of them that we don't get to at the end of this session. So with that in mind, I would like to kind of pose the first question to Nazim, because I think it dovetails nicely with a bit of the conversation from the last session, which is why carbon markets? Why not other tools for carbon finance?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be talking about carbon markets. To answer your questions, I'd like to first put carbon markets in the broader context of climate finance. It's basically a transition finance tool, and similar to other climate finance mechanisms like green bonds, debts, etc., it basically mobilizes financial resources to act on climate change. What makes carbon markets more specific and more powerful is that they take advantage of power of trade to mobilize investment where it's most cost efficient. So that's why basically carbon markets been known as a fundamental tool to scaling up and to accelerating green transition. So not only they can allocate capital cost efficiently, they can drive systemic change, support innovation, and more importantly, mobilize funding to Global South, protecting nature, etc., in a limited time that we have, especially for the latter. Today, carbon markets cover around 23% of the global emission. Most of it comes from the compliance, as Paula mentioned, a smaller portion from voluntary carbon markets. In total, carbon markets cover around 1 trillion a year, so they can collect that much. And why that number is important, because when you put that in the context of finance gap, you could see the potential that carbon markets could have in delivering climate finance action. That gap is basically what we spend now on climate action in comparison to what we should be spending in order to decarbonize the economy and making sure that we are on track to avoid 2-degree increase in global warming. This gap is, according to IPCC, UNFCCC, and others, is around 4 to 6 trillion a year. That is huge. And then when you look at, especially in the low-income countries, again, according to these UN sources, they need at least 6 trillion a year by 2030 to get that to at least half of their commitment to the Paris Agreement. The global community has pledged to 100 billion a year by 2030. It was extended by 2025. This hasn't been, the collection hasn't been enough at all. And then it, raises the question of, is it the public funding enough to cover this gap? Which is not. We've seen it's not. At least half of it has to come from private sector, and that's where carbon markets are powerful in mobilizing private money into these climate actions. So continuing on, importance of carbon markets, especially as you mentioned, Paula, on Article 6, when you think about a global carbon market or an Article 6 approach, it's very important in the role that it could support both governments and companies achieve their decarbonization target more flexibly and cost efficiently. It's just important to know, when we think about the scale of what is needed to be mobilized, we can't just rely on carbon markets, of course. We need all climate finance levers to get there, especially that in the, thinking about carbon markets, as they are mostly like a result-based mechanism, you need strong support from governments, from financial institutions to provide a more certain environment that de-risks, especially the environment for private sector when it comes to huge projects that need like a huge upfront capital to just get off the ground. I'd like to stop here because one thing I want to mention, with all the power and mighty of carbon markets and what it could deliver, by no means we mean that it's without imperfections and challenges. And I'm sure this panel will go through those and explain what we could do to overcome some of those challenges.
Absolutely. I think the important thing there is to note that it's part of sort of a puzzle of different types of solutions, both from a voluntary and a regulatory perspective. And so I guess building on that a little bit, Nofal, what role do carbon credit schemes, either regulatory or compliant, regulatory and compliance or voluntary, play in combating climate change?
Thank you, Paula. Hi, everyone. I'll probably start with your last sentence, which is, I mean, carbon markets are a puzzle, and being aware of the audience of ICA and this panel, I think what's important to highlight before I go to the answer is what role can we play as FIs, as financial institutions, all collectively to help these markets in MENA, in GCC, and beyond. And I think this is, if there are really few things to take away from this panel that might seem very technical, is there are two types of markets. Our clients rely on us to help them in these markets. It's very technical topics, as you might find out today, even though we're trying to keep it not very technical for non-carbon specialists. And this is really, really important. But we will get back, to these points along the panel. Now, back to your question. Very simply, when you hear about carbon markets, it's as if I say commodities. There are many, many different commodities. There are many, many different carbon markets. There is not a single carbon market. There is not a single carbon price. And this is very important to keep in mind. People expect carbon to be one standard general price, but it's absolutely not the case. It's as wide as saying commodities or fixed income or things like that. But there are two main groups within carbon markets that maybe you can take away as a main point. There are what we call the compliance markets, and there are the voluntary markets. And the compliance market, the starting point is the regulator. And that's why they are very important, because the regulator will decide which industries are in scope and what companies within these industries are in scope. And if you are in scope, or if your clients are in scope, which is more relevant, then they have to participate in the carbon market. There is no way around it. It's almost like a liability created overnight for your clients, where they will come to you and rely on you to help them navigate this. The biggest one out there is the European carbon market, and again, probably very relevant to a lot of your clients and a lot of banks here today. EUAs, you probably heard about EUAs. Is the biggest compliance market. It's the most liquid one. It's very widely traded. And the idea behind the compliance market is it's like a flexible tax. And that creates the incentives for companies to reduce their carbon emissions. And by doing that, there is a financial reward, if I may say, because they either don't have to go and buy these allowances in the market because they have to make sure that they have enough at the end of the year, or they simply have too much allowances given and they don't need all of them, so they can go back to the market and sell them. 1 ton of EUA today is roughly 80 euros per ton. So it's sizable. It's not negligible. It's not a small cost on the side, and it's really, really important. So that's for compliance markets. The other side are voluntary markets. So here, the starting point is not the regulator, is a project that does something to reduce or remove carbon. And this project will go through the process it needs to go through. And it will get credits. And then they will sell these credits onwards to corporates, governments, investors. But this is a voluntary approach. I mean, anyone in this room, as Abdelmalik said earlier, you wanna decarbonize your footprint coming to ICA today, you can go on a website, on a platform and buy some credits. This is purely voluntary. And when it does, back to the question, and I will finish here, to combat climate change, is that it channels financing into projects that eventually will lead to credits.
I think that's an interesting point. Kind of moving on, sort of, I guess, referring back to sort of the reference to the EUA and sort of the difference between that and credits, and kind of this question about a unified price of carbon. Allowances look identical to each other if they're within the same market. They're completely fungible. So whether that allowance is a free allowance to a steel producer or whether it's a free allowance to soon a shipping company, they can be traded interchangeably. Whereas when you're looking at credits, different attributes of the project very much affect the price of credit and sort of really can play, I think, a big role in channeling that investment to certain types of projects. So, Fazil, I guess I'll move to you next, which is what role carbon markets play within the broader ET conversation, and can they really help to hasten that decarbonization journey?
Thanks, Paula. So when you talk about the global emissions, easily more than 60 to 80% of emissions are associated with the energy sector, whether it is oil and gas or utilities or manufacturing industries, I mean, whatever connected with the use of energy and the associated production. And this number, as you can imagine, is even bigger in our region. So I see it from two ways, how it supports energy transition. First and foremost is what our panelists already mentioned. It's a source of financing. So if you want to reduce emissions, of course, you go and try to optimize in your operations, whether it is energy efficiency, energy recovery, and so on. But a good number of measures these days requires a lot of capital. Say, for example, if I'm going for a carbon capture or a direct air capture, you are paying a price of somewhere around $600 to $800 per ton to reduce that, right? And especially for companies who are there to make profits, that is a huge burden on them. Of course, while we recognize the environmental targets to meet. So when I say the 600 to 800, if we try to register your direct air capture project in a market, you could easily get prices in the range of 250 to 500 depending on the market you're registering. So which means it's a source of financing wherein up to 60% of your what capital is required is met by carbon markets. I mean, these numbers vary from project to project based on additionality and the different types of market. But again, the point is it's a source of financing for you to drive your emission reduction projects. That's one angle of it. Second is it also gives an opportunity for you to buy the credits to offset your own emissions. I mean, there will be a point of time where you are so efficient, it may not make sense to put, even if you put more and more money for energy efficiency, the amount of improvement you get may not be that great. So what you have then do is you have to go and purchase offsets to make sure you reduce your emissions. Concept being you're investing in some other emission projects elsewhere. So it's an option to purchase offsets and then make sure you show that in the accounting and you're meeting your targets, depending on the scheme which you have, whether it is compliance or whatever as per the regulation. So yeah, I mean, as I said, energy emissions are the biggest contributor. So how do you want to meet it is you have to come up with a lot of emission reduction measures. So the way I see carbon financing is a mechanism to raise capital, especially for some tough projects where it doesn't have any financial gains without the influx of the carbon credits. And second, it gives you an option to offset your emissions by purchasing some credits. So, and even more significant, I think, for the energy transition agenda for the region is we talk a lot about decarbonization, but then we have energy security issues to face. We have energy affordability issues to face. There's a lot of regions here, countries in this part of the world where you don't even have energy in the first place, right? So energy use is expected to go up, but what you have to ensure is when you produce that energy, how you are actually producing in a sustainable way is the question. So it becomes much more important for this region where there is a higher growth compared to other parts of the world.
I think that's an interesting thing to touch on because the energy security and affordability question is a big one that plays into sort of what does additionality mean in carbon markets, particularly I would argue in places like MENA. And I would like to pose this question to the group, but I'll start with you, Fazil. What role have carbon markets traditionally played within MENA, and what sort of opportunities do you see for them moving forward, particularly when you're talking about these issues around energy security and affordability?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just give my view of additionality. It's a very tough concept to explain, but basically it means, let's say you have an emission reduction project and you're going to whatever scheme you have to register a project to get eligibility for carbon credits. You have to prove that this project would not have happened if not for support getting from the carbon credits. Simply means you cannot just go and register any emission reduction for carbon credits, right? You have to show either there was an investment challenge, You have to show there was a technical barrier perhaps, or you have to show there was a market barrier. So the idea is you are explaining to the body who is giving you the eligibility to produce credits that you had a challenge and you're getting the support from the carbon credit. So that's the whole concept of additionality. Now, to what level you apply that concept, the threshold is where the challenges we have, which Paula indicated at the start. But the region and the carbon markets, I think, if you trace 10 years back, or no, 10 to 15 years back, whatever projects which we had in the region, it was all linked to UNFCCC CDM. I won't say there were a lot of them, but there were a good number of projects in this part of the world which registered for emission reduction projects or registered under UNFCCC's Clean Development Mechanism, especially at a time when the prices were so high. But afterwards, I would say after 2012, perhaps when the carbon markets crashed because of EU pulling out of it, because of various other reasons, the prices came down and countries here or the companies here started to look for voluntary markets. But again, it was not something which was very common until maybe, I would say it's very recently in the last 1 to 2 years, things have picked up agenda. I think there are some good number of examples. In Saudi, you have the MENA voluntary carbon markets, some of the big names coming into the picture led by PIF, and of course, they're going and supporting in countries, continents such as Africa. UAE has in fact come up with their own market or an exchange. And the good step which we see in the UAE is they came one step ahead, and the FSRA, which is the regulatory authority, they even has come up with a guideline which tells, or a regulation which tells carbon, yes, carbon can be treated as a commodity. Because as Naufal mentioned, end of the day, it is a commodity, but then whether the financial regulatory bodies accepted it as a commodity was a challenge for the treasury and the financial accounting people. But UAE went a step ahead and they have actually accepted it. There is more and more national registries coming up in the region. So it's a start. There are more and more voluntary standards of the markets coming up here in the region. Mainly it comes down to the potential which I mentioned because of the energy growth and the potential to reduce emissions. So it's in a starting phase, mainly looking from a voluntary perspective. There are discussions how we can turn that into a compliance side. If not soon, it could come, depending on the pressures externally.
Surely that presents quite a lot of opportunities as well. Naufal, do you have any sort of thoughts on that to follow up?
Yeah, so look, this market is very much a nice nascent stage in the region. I mean, it's clear, and what's very important, and again, why it's so important to address an audience like the one today, is because as the market starts growing and as the market starts shaping up, we need enablers, we need the whole ecosystem to shape up, and this is such an important thing. I mean, TACA or large corporates in the UAE, of course, as you can hear from Fazil, they are much ahead of the curve. They are very much aware of these markets, but this is not the case for all the corporates. So we need clients we need to raise awareness of our clients, and I think this is the key for us, and this should be the key role for us as banks. As I said earlier, we are in a new world. We are in a world where regulation can change dramatically overnight, pretty much, and that can have a huge impact on our clients. I'm really talking from a perspective of a bank and providing services to our clients. You know, our clients can find themselves with a liability created overnight, and I will take the example. I mean, there are many examples, but I'll take the example of the shipping industry under EUAs. So shipping companies going into Europe will be subject, I mean, back to my first point, where the regulator defines which companies are in scope and what industries are in scope. So shipping is now in scope of the EUA scheme from the 1st of January 2024. I'm sure in the room you have clients or companies here in the room that have shipping companies in their books that are exposed to this change in regulation. So now where do these clients go when this suddenly becomes reality, when they have to account for their emissions, when they have to submit EUA allowances at the end of the year to offset their emissions. This is happening. This is reality. So it usually tends to take longer for the ecosystem to pick it up, and then suddenly it becomes very urgent, and everyone has to do it before the deadline. But it is a reality, and there are many examples like that. So we really have to, for me, this is the biggest challenge, is to raise awareness. And actually, we are organizing later today, and I really recommend everyone to join a session at 4 p.m., which is going to be a roundtable to see how we can collectively build an FI MENA Carbon Alliance. We are very happy being FAB to help in the, I mean, we've been in the carbon market for more than 2 years now. We have very sophisticated clients, as you can hear from Fazil. So we are in this market, and we are very keen to help develop, I mean, with WEF and other partners here in the room, develop this market. So it's really, because we see it as an ecosystem, we see it as we either all develop this ecosystem or it's not going to work. Now, in terms of opportunities, I think this presents a huge opportunity for banks. As Fazil was mentioning, in Abu Dhabi, carbon credits now are financial instruments, are commodities, so this brings banks into the ecosystem with all the banking instruments we have, with all the banking toolkit we have to finance projects, to finance our clients who are looking for financing into this project. But I think really banks should look at it as an opportunity to bring their know-how and their knowledge into this very new market.
One point, if I may add, I think a point in order is regulations in other parts of the world are also hitting the region. Best example in case is actually CBAM, Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism. So companies, I mean, it has a phasing for the different sectors, but you can already see aluminum and steel sectors, for example. Now they have to actually, they're actually thinking about it seriously, and it's affecting the margin. I mean, especially when they have a large consumer footprint in the Europe, whatever they sell as a product, you have to measure the intensity, and so that has already started hitting for some sectors, and there is a phase sector by sector as you might be touching upon. So external is also hitting the region, I would say.
Yeah, and if I'm so sorry, just to jump on this, CBAM is a reality for a lot of corporates, and I'm sure, again, for a lot of your clients for the banks here today. CBAM is such a big thing happening in Europe, and I think it's really a game changer that's going to force a lot of countries to develop their own carbon.
I didn't cover CBAM as a definition as part of my definitions, and I probably should have. So it's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is the EU's piece to kind of essentially manage the issue of carbon leakage, and it potentially has a huge impact on well, it doesn't even potentially, it will have a huge impact on imports into Europe across different sectors that are covered under the EU emissions trading system, which is sort of, I guess, kind of a follow-up question to the group, really. What sort of infrastructure challenges are still lacking in order to make this possible, to make trading a little bit more effective, and to really scale up carbon markets trading within MENA and globally?
I'll say that.
Do you want to start?
I can say that.
It's not an easy question.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, the challenges, as I was mentioning earlier, we need a real demand. And to have a real demand from people who need to buy, from businesses who really need to buy, you need clear regulation. I mean, as much as we want to think that we have corporations happy to spend to offset their carbon footprint for the good of the climate, this will not move the market. What will move the market is really clear regulation from these various countries, and that will help shape up the new carbon market. So I think Nassim can tell you more about Article 6, which is, without going too technical, it's in my opinion the future of this market, because it's going to be driven by the UN, and that's going to become a voluntary market under a compliance market with voluntary credits, pretty much. And we need clarity around Article 6. We need capacity building for Article 6 in the countries that are looking to join Article 6 under NDCs. But look, I don't want to get too technical. I think we we need to invest in these markets. We need to invest in our clients. We need to raise the awareness of our clients, and we need to help the local exchanges to build liquidity around these credits.
Would you like to?
Yeah, sure. So maybe just coming back and looking at the big picture, like we're talking about the region that is more sensitive to the consequences of climate change. It gets heated up twice as much as the rest of the world. 16 countries in the region have committed to Paris Agreement. Only half of those have actually net zero target in their policy. When you look at the private sector side of the equation, it looks even less promising. Only 7% of corporates have actually net zero and plan to get there. Well, that 7% is, of course, some of the biggest ones, and when you look at the share in the market, that the percentage will be, of course, different. But then this image tells you that a lot need to be done, both on the government side and on the private sector side. And as my fellow panelists well put it, that it's basically needs something that is more coherent, maybe something in the form of a regional market that could mobilize funding from government and private. But then when you think about an Article 6 approach, it basically needs 3 main building blocks. One is governance. So what Nafal was referring to, regulations, putting policy in place, provide that certainty about what counts as a credible decarbonization or net zero plan, how to get there, what sort of projects are qualified there, how much you could trade on the carbon market, how much do you want to invest internally to get to your net zero commitment. So that all comes from the government. And so for that, a regional, a strong Article 6 market requires a lot of engagement from government and a lot of support from them. Then it comes to the financing this transition, and of course, that is a collective action that comes from government, private sector, financial institution, thinking about the innovative mechanism, how to get some projects off the ground, how to transition the movement to net zero. And you are all expert on that, so it would be great to discuss that maybe later in the session that we have. What are these innovative mechanisms that the financial institutions could offer? Because it's not a burden to be carried by just one player. Then it comes to infrastructure, and that is probably the easier part, the technology, the platforms, the registries, which are already shaping. So there's huge appetite in the region already. We've seen that the ambition of private sector have led to creation of voluntary carbon in the market, but the compliance side is still to catch up. So I would say everyone has a responsibility here to really find a way to get there, because the region badly needs it. We see countries with, high emitting countries with a lot of capital and ambition to get net zero. We have on the other side of a spectrum companies or countries that need that funding to basically fund their sustainable development. So while we have this spectrum, this basically buyers and suppliers side in the same region, there's a lot of potential to already be thinking about that sort of mechanism that could, of course, I'm hoping that this COP could help clarify some of the ambiguities or uncertainties that are around Article 6. But then that's a picture that I see, or what could make sense as a next step to decarbonize the region.
So surely, that's potentially a key role for financial institutions in this place, correct? I would think.
Yes, so FIs have a big role to play in this. So as I was mentioning earlier, raising awareness, helping your clients with your usual banking tools, so whether it's hedging tools or financing tools or any other tools is really important. But the main role FIs should play, in my opinion, in this is to connect the various stakeholders. We should sit in the middle. We should be the central hub in our own countries or regions and help project developers, help corporates looking to buy, help the policymakers understand. And this is this is so important. It's really important that the FIs play this role, because this is a vital role for this whole thing to work. You know, I mentioned shipping and e-ways earlier, which in my opinion is key, but I could have mentioned CORSIA for airlines is as relevant. I mean, almost, if not all, GCC countries have signed up to CORSIA, which is, again, without getting too technical, CORSIA is a compliance market using voluntary credits, pretty much. And so if you are, let's assume your country is one of those that signed up to CORSIA, and as I said, many GCC countries have signed up, many African countries signed up. That means that any flights between two CORSIA countries will have to offset their carbon footprint. That means that the airlines in your, I mean, you have airlines in your book, you have airlines as your clients, they will get hit by this. CORSIA phase 1 is starting in 2024. 24-26 is CORSIA CP1. At the end of phase 1, the airlines will have to make sure that they submit these credits and they retire to offset their are they ready? Are they having these discussions today? Are you, as banks, ready to have these discussions with them today and to help them with securing the inventory, or helping them with understanding their needs? I think these are the questions we have to ask ourselves, and this is the role we should play. And then, as banks, we have to, as Fazil was mentioning earlier, we have to bring all our financing toolkit into the game. We have to help project develop. We have to help our clients, our project developers, with financing solutions, and I think that would be really key.
I think to sort of follow up for kind of perhaps the last question for the group as well, carbon markets have very much been in the news lately. I'm sure many of the folks within this room have a lot of questions about different aspects about them, some of the issues that have been reported, some of the questions about, you know, whether projects meet sort of the requirements that they're supposed to meet, whether they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, et cetera. So it has been a year for controversy. It's had a big impact on voluntary carbon credit prices. It's potential, I mean, it has also affected the appetite for investment, and I think the appetite for risk among some market players. I guess the question is, how do we reconcile the challenges of credit markets? Because you're never going to be able to prove necessarily perfect additionality or perfect permanence in these sorts of situations, but credits are necessary. We're at a point in the carbon budgets where allowances and cuts aren't going to cut it. There needs to be some sort of credit component around projects there. So how do you reconcile that question with the need for carbon financing for a just transition? Do you want to start off?
Yeah, so rightly so, it's been a special year for carbon markets. And I want to maybe make it clear when we say those scrutinies or those articles that we see criticizing carbon markets is mostly directing at voluntary carbon markets. So the compliance market's been less so of the center of attention here. And that's basically exactly as reasons that you said. The credits come with a lot of attributes and a lot of uncertainty. Voluntary carbon markets been around for like 2 decades or so, but still they are in early development stage. They haven't reached maturity. I think the volume now is around 1.3 billion a year, but a lot of analysis shows that it could reach up to 50 billion by 2030 if companies start putting money strategically in voluntary carbon markets. But why is that? Why we don't see that growth? And it's because the market is so uncertain. It's not incentivizing for corporates to put money in, and that's because of a lot of challenges. If you want to think about categorizing the challenges from the supply side, the credibility and the quality of these carbon projects been under question. In a lot of cases, the criticism that we hear are correct. So the practice hasn't been perfect, basically because there's been lack of guidance and what counts as credible carbon credit. Then on the buyer side, there's been a lot of confusion about what counts as a credible claim. Companies putting money in, a carbon project in somewhere and claiming a product is carbon neutral. Is it correct? is it scientifically based? And that's been another challenge, and that has created this, a lot of greenwashing accusation and let a lot of good players out of the game because of the act of bad players. And even those that are actively doing good practice or taking good practice have been pushed to what we call greenwashing. So they just don't talk about their activities because they're afraid of being accused of they did it wrong. Then in a broader spectrum, or thinking about voluntary carbon market in general, there's lack of guidance for hard-to-abate industries. So what is the solution for those that can't really follow the hardest stepwise guideline to really go to the last residual emission that they can't do anything about, while their emissions is too huge that they can't get to 90% of direct reduction? Talking about mining, about steel, about all those sectors, it's basically there is no pragmatic solution for them. So while there's been this year especially a good year in terms of a lot of initiatives producing some guidelines, like International Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Market, ICVCM, has set guideline for the supply side, what counts or like minimum standard for carbon credits. Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, VCMI, has put a guideline for the buyer side. But then that last part of not being encouraged, not enough incentive and recognition for corporates still remains. So there are a lot of challenges, of course, but then when you think about the role that the voluntary carbon market could play in mobilizing funding for protect nature projects, for support local community development, for mobilizing funding to Global South, you can't just throw the baby with bathwater. It's just the criticism is very important to make it improve, but it's it's not a tool to be dismissed, especially not in the short term with the limited time that we have to hopefully make a lot of those irreversible changes in the climate happen. It's a really collective effort, going back to all that we've been talking about on this panel. It takes effort from governments, from standard setters, from corporates, from financial institutions to provide transparency, trust, and credibility to the market. It is something that has to put voluntary carbon market in a narrative that is not only doing bads and exploiting workers in Global South and etc. But it has to be put in in a more positive tone that it is essential. It has imperfections, but there's a lot of room to improve it, and that's the responsibility of everyone in the market.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Do you have anything to add? I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions, but we probably have time for...
I mean, we all agree there is benefits with carbon markets and carbon financing, but at the end of the day, the challenge is it's so confusing. So I think number one is awareness is very critical across the board. I mean, carbon itself, greenhouse gas accounting itself is a bit complex topic to talk about, and then you're bringing all those trading schemes and everything. So I think awareness is very critical, as the panelists mentioned. I think second for me is regulation is important. I think no matter whatever guidelines you have from whatever bodies, but at the end of the day, unless financial regulator steps in and they put the norms and clarity to it, I don't think the corporates or anyone will have a trust on what is out there. As Nazim mentioned, that they will have the green hushing challenge as well. They know they're doing something good, but then they were afraid to talk about the topic, afraid of whatever accusations could come. So I think, yeah, financial regulators stepping in and providing a clarity is very important. And even any countries implementing any scheme, I think it's very important to do a proper feasibility study, because what works in one market may not work in the other market. For example, in one market, easiest option or what works for all might be the carbon tax, but not necessarily in another market. And end of the day, we have to make sure this does not look complicated for the businesses. They should see that more as an opportunity rather than as like a risk. Because the moment people start thinking this as a risk, then they're going away from it. So yeah, I think awareness plus financial regulators stepping in, those are the two things which is essential going forward.
Thank you very much. So I think we have some time for some questions, if there are any from the audience. Anyone at all? No? No one wants to be brave? I mean, I've got more questions, so we can always do that. Okay. No one? Okay, cool. So I guess one of the things we've talked about is, I think, a little bit around Article 6 and sort of what this actually means for everyone. This has been an interesting year for carbon markets in Africa in particular with the Nairobi Declaration. It's really, I think, probably the first time. Historically, the Global South has always sort of been the source of the project credits rather than necessarily the taker for them, whereas the Nairobi Declaration really presents the first opportunity to provide a more unified approach to sort of African climate finance in general ahead of COP28. And I was just wondering if anyone had thoughts about what that meant going into the negotiations, what that means for Africa, what that means for MENA as a broader region. Anyone want to kick it off?
Just a few words. I think it's a very positive initiative. It's important to, as you said, put the African countries in the driver's seat. So it's not just they're a source of receiving funds that have been actually very insufficient, but then they decide where they want to get the funds, where it's most cost efficient, where it's most important for their development to spend that. In terms of how to get there, I think that's the question. So hopefully this COP helps to clarify the mechanism to get there and to support decarbonization in Africa. That's, to me, it's more questions than answers, to be honest, but it's definitely a positive move.
Yeah, it's definitely positive. I think end of the day, the key thing is to make sure Africa themselves gets benefit out of it. I think some of the greenwashing incidents which you told, or controversies we saw earlier this year, is there were a lot of nature-based projects which were implemented in Africa. Investments came from outside, but then did Africa got the benefits out of it is a different question, because the money from the credits went elsewhere. So I think it's very important when something happens in Africa, that Africa gets benefit out of it. Because Africa, the challenge is there are a lot of countries who have a lot of fossil fuel resources, and they badly need energy, right? But then from some corners, there have been challenges or accusations, or like they cannot go and explore those assets, right? And then they're compromising the energy security. So it's very important to make sure the people of Africa or the countries themselves get benefit out of those schemes. But yeah, I think the intent is all good. It looks promising.
Nafal, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would like to say, not really on this point, but more as a, because I think we're going to conclude soon.
Yeah, I'm watching.
Is just, you know, we try to give an overview of the carbon markets, the compliance markets, voluntary markets, a few initiatives that are out there. But, you know, while it might seem very far maybe for people sitting in this room or covering certain geographies where this might not be the topic yet, I promise you, this is very real. It's very live. As I said, EUA compliance market is catching up with the shipping companies you're covering and going into Europe. You will need to find a way to help them. Otherwise, they will go find help somewhere else. CORSIA for airlines is very real. I mean, your airlines, many countries are in. Have signed up to CORSIA, so if you are in one of those countries, which is very likely, then your airlines will have to deal with this issue, and they will probably come to you to solve this issue, and they will expect help from their FIs or the banks they work with. And I will say one more time, I mean, it's really important, and that's why we think it's very important to have some kind of a carbon alliance for FIs, and this is the reason we're organizing this session this afternoon. So please feel free to join. It's at 4 p.m. in Medina meeting room. So please join us, and the idea is really to share our experience. We've been doing this for a few years now with, as you can see, large, I mean, very advanced corporates and some others, and see how we can work together and in these markets.
I think that's a good point to end on as well. I mean, it's important to note, I mean, both from this panel and I think from the first panel as well, exposure to climate risk is increasing, which affects everybody in this room. Carbon markets are iterating, they're growing, they're not getting smaller, despite the controversy, whether that's on an international level or on a national level. So it's absolutely something that's really here already and is only going to get more visible as time moves on. So I guess I will release you all to lunch with that thought. If you do have any other questions, please note that the session is at 4 p.m. For the workshop. And thank you very much to the panelists. And thank you much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. There is no lunch, as you know. We have a
oh, sorry,
we
my
have
bad.
a keynote speech right now. So, you guys want to take a picture? Wait, you want to take a picture of the? Can you please a round of applause for our amazing panelists for this carbon panel? Thank you so much, Paula, for your stewardship of this panel. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, just a little bit of house management again. Departure for what's not a dinner but an experience will start at 6:30 p.m. So please make sure you are in front of the hotel to take the shuttles and to go to the Beldy Country Club for the gala dinner. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let us embark on a journey. If you can just imagine with me this. You're an amazingly successful banker. You've been CEO of Crédit Agricole, and then you're appointed as General Treasurer of the Kingdom of Morocco, a guy that always receives call Tom Cruise style, show me the money. Where is the money? Did you receive the money? So this gentleman, ladies and gentlemen, who's about to give you a keynote speech in 2010 was vested with the daunting task of building from scratch a financial center in Morocco. Fast forward 13 years later, Casablanca Finance City, chaired by Said Ibrahimi, who's about to join us, is the leading financial center of Africa, ranked #1 in the GFCI index. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please give a round of applause for President Ibrahimi, who's about to give us his insights. Welcome. Welcome, Mr. President.
Good morning, everyone. While I was listening to Mulay Malik Alawi, I just thought by myself, when I'm attending such conference, I don't like long speeches. And I realized that I have a long speech. So sorry for that. Well, let's start. I will try to give you an overview of what we have done with CFC and some ideas about African development and, of course, some features about Morocco. Well, let me start by saying that it's really a great honor to address you today as the CEO of Casablanca Finance City, the Moroccan Financial Center created under the leadership of His Majesty King Mohammed VI. May God assist him. Since the inception, more than a decade ago, His Majesty's foresight has been instrumental in establishing CFC as a beacon of financial excellence, not only within Morocco, but across the African continent. Our journey at CFC began with the ambitious goal of transforming Casablanca into a leading global financial hub. Today, I'm proud to say that we have made significant strides towards this goal by focusing on providing a favorable business environment with competitive financial policies, advanced infrastructure, and a streamlined regulatory framework. We have established ourselves as a preferred destination for international investors and global companies. Casablanca, as it has been mentioned, holds the top position as the leading financial center in Africa, according to the Global Financial Centers Index, a ranking that we have successfully maintained for 7 consecutive years. Naturally, you would expect nothing short that this kind of pitch from the CEO of such an institution. But since we are among friends, I can say that this tells you only half the story. Our story at CFC is also the story of Morocco, a country that cultivates its singularity in a region where stability is greatly needed. And over the past 2 decades, Morocco has demonstrated remarkable stability on both macroeconomic and institutional levels, distinguishing itself as a model of consistent development in the region. Economically, the country has maintained a relatively stable GDP growth rate, averaging around 4 or 5% annually before the COVID-19 pandemic, showcasing resilience in the face of global economic fluctuations. This stability is supported by a diversified economy, strong agricultural sector, growing tourism, and renewable energy industries. Political stability has been another cornerstone of Morocco's success. The constitutional reform of 2011, which introduced a more democratic framework and strengthened the rule of law, have played a crucial role in maintaining internal stability and boosting investors' confidence. These reforms, coupled with the consistent economic policies, have positioned Morocco as a stable and attractive destination for both regional and international investors, setting a benchmark for stability and growth in the region. Institutionally, Morocco has undergone significant reforms to enhance transparency, governance, and legal frameworks. This commitment to institutional stability and reform has been a cornerstone in attracting foreign direct investment and nurturing confidence among global business communities. In terms of infrastructure, Morocco also made important steps during the last 20 years, with 1,800 kilometers of highways, 18 airports, the first port in Africa, Tangimed, and the first high-speed train, TGV, in Africa. Morocco has marked a significant milestone in the region's transportation infrastructure. In Casablanca, we boast the largest airport in Morocco and the 4th largest in Africa, offering over 100 air connections worldwide and 35 flight connections with capitals across the African continent. As a result of this proactive strategy, Bloomberg recently identified Morocco as one of the top 5 standout connector nations, emerging as important links in a global economy that's fragmenting into rival blocs. Morocco's strong trade ties with Europe and the United States, as well as its openness to foreign direct investments, make it a meeting place where companies aligned on either side of the growing US-China divide can compete or collaborate. In addressing the theme of today's conference, the value proposition for global businesses in African financial centers, like CFC, lies in our ability to offer a unique blend of stability, connectivity, and opportunity. We are not just a financial center, we are a gateway to growing African market with its vast and tapped potential. Our role is to bridge the gap between international investors and African opportunities, creating a win-win situation for all stakeholders. As you know, Africa's economic potential is immense and multifaceted, underpinned by a rapidly growing population, expanding urbanization, and an increasing shift towards industrialization. As of 2021, Africa's population exceeded 1.3 billion people, representing about 17% of the world's population, a figure projected to double by 2050. This demographic surge presents a substantial market size with a burgeoning young workforce which can drive economic growth and innovation. Urbanization is another key trend, with cities like Casablanca, Lagos, Cairo, and Kinshasa among the world's largest and fastest growing. These urban centers are becoming hubs of commercial and industrial activity, contributing significantly to their respective national economies. Despite challenges, Africa's collective GDP, standing at $2.6 trillion in 2021, demonstrates potential for significant growth. With the operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area, aiming to create a single market for goods and services, the continent is poised to become the world's largest free trade area, which could further accelerate industrialization and enhance Africa's position in the global economy. But to reach these objectives, many challenges must be tackled. Africa, with its vast landscapes and rapidly growing economies, faces significant logistical challenges, particularly in the realms of ports and airports infrastructure. Across the continent, logistics is often hampered by underdeveloped or aging infrastructure, leading to inefficiencies in the movement of goods. For instance, many African ports are plagued by congestion and outdated facilities which slow down cargo processing. The World Bank's Logistic Performance Index frequently ranks African countries lower in terms of logistics efficiency compared to global standards. In terms of numbers, African ports handle only about 6% of global sea freight, reflecting limited capacity and inefficiencies. Average container dwell times in African ports can be as high as 20 days, compared to just a few days in more developed ports globally. Air transport in Africa also faces hurdles. While the continent accounts for about 12% of the world's population, it represents only 1% of global air cargo, highlighting the underutilization of and inefficiencies in air freight logistics. To overcome this challenge, I wish to highlight the recent initiative by His Majesty the King to build an integrated and comprehensive full-spectrum strategy for the Africa's Atlantic shores. With these historic initiatives, Africa will be able to open up to the American market and benefit fully from its increasing producive capacity. The second challenge for Africa is undoubtedly access to capital, especially for the private sector. Indeed, access to capital remains a significant challenge for private companies in Africa, constraining their growth and development potential. Despite being one of the fastest growing regions globally, African businesses often struggle to secure funding due to a variety of factors. For instance, the African Development Bank reports that the continent faces a substantial annual funding gap estimated at between 130 billion to 170 billion US dollars. This shortfall is more pronounced for small and medium-sized enterprises, which constitute around 90% of businesses in Africa, but often find themselves excluded from traditional banking services. Limited access to credit is a major obstacle, with banks often reluctant to lend to SMEs due to perceived high risks and inadequate collateral. The World Bank's enterprise surveys indicate that about only 20% of African SMEs have a line of credit or a loan from a financial institution. But these challenges, although sometimes daunting, are regarded by African financial centers, including CFC, as opportunities as well. The challenges of logistical inefficiencies and restricted access to capital in Africa, while significant, also present unique opportunities for African financial centers. These centers can act as catalysts for addressing these issues, thereby attracting multinational companies and fostering economic growth. Firstly, financial centers can facilitate the development of more robust financial ecosystems, which are crucial for improving access to capital. Moreover, financial centers like CFC can play a pivotal role in developing and implementing innovative financial solutions to enhance logistical networks. This can include structured financing for infrastructure projects like ports and airport upgrades, or new transport links, which are essential for improving the efficiency of goods movement across the continent. By mobilizing capital for such infrastructural development, financial centers can directly contribute to reducing logistical bottlenecks, making African markets more attractive to international investors. Additionally, these centers can serve as hubs for policy advocacy and regulatory reforms, promoting more business-friendly environment. This is particularly appealing for multinational companies that often grapple with regulatory complexities in emerging markets. Furthermore, financial centers offer platforms for financial innovation, such as fintech solutions, which can revolutionize both access to finance and logistical operations. For instance, digital platforms can streamline supply chain processes, while mobile banking and fintech services can provide alternative financing options to underserved businesses. In essence, African financial centers are not just passive players, but active facilitators in addressing some of the continent's most pressing economic challenges. Through their multifaceted roles, centers like CFC can drive investment, spur economic growth, and ultimately contribute to the realization of Africa's vast economic potential. In this context, the global financial landscape is increasingly competitive, with financial centers vying for attention from international businesses. To stay ahead, we must continuously innovate and adapt. This means embracing digital transformation, fostering fintech ecosystems, and staying ahead of the curve in terms of regulatory compliance. Our challenge is to balance these global standards with the need to remain flexible and responsive to the unique needs of the African market. A crucial aspect of our strategy at CFC is investing in human capital. Building a pool of skilled professionals is essential for the sustainable growth of financial centers. We are committed to nurturing talent that can drive innovation and meet the evolving needs of the global financial industry. This includes partnerships with educational institutions, continuous professional development programs, and creating opportunities for young African talent. In the era of digitization, staying technologically advanced is not just an option, but a necessity. At CFC, we are fostering an environment that encourages technological innovation. our focus is on supporting fintech startups and embracing digital solutions that can revolutionize financial services across Africa. This not only enhances our competitiveness, but also aligns with our vision of a tech-driven financial sector. In conclusion, the journey to establish an African financial centers like CFC as competitive and attractive on the global stage is a journey of continuous evolution and adaptation. Inspired by the vision of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, we at CFC are committed to this path, recognizing that our success is intertwined with the broader economic success of Africa. By embracing the challenges of global competition, regulatory complexities, and the digital revolution, we are poised to make a significant impact on the continent's economic landscape. Together, let's work towards a future where African financial centers are not just participants in the global financial system, but are leaders shaping its evolution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Ibrahim. We will not let you go just like this. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for President Ibrahimi. I invite all of you to engage with him and his team. And if you ever visit Casablanca, you have to go visit the CFC Tower. He has amazing teams, very much business friendly, and they're very much committed into making this, this financial center one of the greatest of Africa and maybe of the region. But we cannot go ahead of ourselves. Thank you very much, President Ibrahimi. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we like to finish the morning with a bang. So we have the great privilege of having the man, the myth, and the legend for our next speaker. He was a member of the IMF for several years, where he stewarded some countries. He was one of the very few privileged people in the IMF who had 2 windows in his office, which gives you an idea of his status. And after he served as the governor of the Central Bank of Pakistan in pivotal times in 2019, when Pakistan was going through an immense financial crisis, and he put all of his negotiating skills and his precise knowledge of financial institutions and multilateral organizations into resorbing this debt and working towards a solution. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, you can welcome Dr. Reza Bakir, who is the global head of sovereign advisory at Alvarez & Marsal, who's going to give you his last presentation before we can all go to lunch. As you noticed, we have Mediterranean timing. So anytime you eat at home at 12:30, here we eat at 1:30. Welcome, welcome, Dr. Reza Bakir. Such an honor to have you here. And good luck for your presentation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. It is a real pleasure to be back in Marrakech after the annual meetings. My sincere gratitude to Mr. Abdul Malik, but also his team, who have been exceptionally efficient and gracious with all the organization that they've done. Before I begin, I'd just like to request that we all observe a moment of silence for the loss of life on all sides in the region. I was asked to talk today about the challenges of sovereign debt in the world. And I'm going to do so by organizing my remarks in 4 key steps. The first is I'm going to talk about what are the current facts on the sovereign debt situation in the world. How bad is the debt situation right now? Second, I'm going to talk about if, as I will show you, the debt stocks and the pace at which they have risen is unprecedented. How did we get here without anticipating these challenges? 3 years ago, nobody was talking about how serious the debt situation would be in some of these countries. So how did we miss it? Third, I'm going to talk about, given these sovereign debt challenges, what is being done about it, and in particular, what has been the response of the international financial community. And last, given the shortcomings in that response from the international financial community, I'll talk a little bit about what could be done so that the current state of debt distress in many countries around the world could be resolved in a faster manner. Now, as I speak with you and I share with you my thoughts on the sovereign debt state and the sovereign debt challenges, it's important I also be transparent about how my own views have been shaped on these issues. So as Mr. Abdul Malik mentioned, I was at the IMF for nearly 20 years. And for 4 of those years, I was the head of the IMF's debt policy division, which is the division in the IMF that is in charge of all sovereign debt policies, including the debt sustainability assessment framework, as well as sovereign debt restructuring policies. This is 2011 to 2015, when we had the then largest debt restructuring in the world that was in Greece, and we had a few other sovereign debt challenges as well. In that time, I was also the representative of the IMF to the Paris Club, where official debt restructurings are negotiated. Then when I resigned from the IMF to go back to Pakistan and do public service, I suddenly found myself as the governor of a high debt country, which itself was experiencing problems, and on the other side of the table with the IMF. And that was a learning experience. And now finally, in the private sector, running a sovereign advisory services firm based out of Dubai, but with a global coverage, where our clients are countries that are experiencing sovereign debt challenges. So I cover my views on sovereign debt are shaped by these 3 different experiences that I've had. So let me quickly then walk you with some of the facts on sovereign debt, the state of sovereign debt. The panel on the left shows you in blue what is the debt level in % of GDP for emerging markets and developing economies. And in black, the same concept for advanced economies. Right now, according to the IMF, the average debt to GDP in emerging markets is around 67% of GDP. Is that high? Is that low? Well, one way to think about it, how high or low it is to ask what it was about a decade ago. And you'll see about 10 years ago, that level was around 37% of GDP. So in about a decade, debt to GDP in emerging markets has risen by 30 points of GDP. If you look at the forecast for the IMF's World Economic Outlook, that number is going to grow to around 75% of GDP over the next 5 years. So in other words, over the past 15 years, debt stocks in emerging markets have doubled. And if you look at this line, the blue line on the left, this pace of increase, as well as the level of debt, is unprecedented since the IMF's World Economic Outlook began presenting statistics in a comprehensive way since 2020. So that's my first point about the level of debt. A related point is it just being driven by some countries? For instance, China has had an unprecedented increase in the level of debt, and it has a big weight in the emerging markets average. But it's not just a China story. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, the numbers are equally striking. On average, in sub-Saharan Africa, the debt to GDP ratio has doubled over the past 1 decade. And in 5 countries over the past decade, it has increased by 50 percentage points of GDP. What this also means is that there is a lot of crowding out of spending. Instead of going for development purposes or fighting climate-related issues, it's going on meeting interest expense. The median interest expense in % of revenue over this period has increased from about 5% to 10% of revenues right now. So it is a challenge that is diversified. On the right is one of the determinants of the increase in debt, which just shows the overall fiscal balance. As the line dips, starting from well around 2007, you'll see that emerging markets right now are running fiscal deficits at unprecedented levels. Now, what this leads then, these rising debt stocks, is challenges in the markets for a number of these countries. Since this is an audience composed of people from the markets, I don't need to spend too much time on these 2 charts. The left showing the distribution of emerging markets by rating, and the right showing the borrowing costs for many of these emerging markets, all showing the tightening financial conditions. But I would like to maybe skip to the next slide and show you which are the countries right now that are experiencing various levels of debt distress. And that is this Venn diagram, which on the left is the IMF's low-income country debt sustainability framework, which is a framework that actually publishes whether the IMF considers that particular country to be in a low, medium, or high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. That's for low-income countries. And the set on the right is middle-income countries that have a different debt sustainability assessment framework that doesn't put them in categories, but I show the countries that have borrowing costs on international sovereign bonds in double digits. The total number of countries is 53 on this slide. So there are 53 countries right now which are experiencing some form of debt challenge, either as measured by the IMF's debt sustainability assessment framework or for those that have market access by the borrowing costs. So my first goal was to just show you what is the current state of debt and the fact that these levels of debt stocks are unprecedented, both in terms of the level and the sharp rise. So my second point now is how did we get here? In 2020, I remember going as the governor for the IMF from Pakistan to the annual meetings, and there the theme there was low for long. Right now, we are all talking about higher for longer. Just 3 years ago, I remember in the IMFC, all the pundits, the best economic minds in the world, talking and explaining. And what ended up happening is that during COVID, a number of countries gave large fiscal stimulus, as well as significant monetary easing. In advanced economies, debt rose by, on average, around 20% of GDP. In emerging markets, around 10 to 15% of GDP. The first response from the international community was to think that this was a liquidity crisis, and there was a sharp increase in lending through the RFI, the Rapid Finance Instrument of the IMF, and followed by the DSSI initiative of the international community, which was to reschedule countries' obligations. What was not seen was that for a number of countries, this was more than a liquidity crisis. And if you see in the previous slides the buildup of sovereign debt, you would see that this was not something that was driven just by COVID, but for a number of countries, the increase in debt was well before COVID. So when I look back, find some similarity, just as the global financial community on inflation mistook what were longer-term challenges to inflation as transitory challenges. Similarly, the international financial community mistook what in many cases were solvency problems to be just liquidity problems. And that has created immense challenges right now. So given the level of debt problems, given how the international financial community really didn't see the challenges that were coming, I want to come to now the next stage, which is once defaults began to occur, countries like Zambia, Chad, Sri Lanka, Ghana, what was the response from the international financial community? And the first response came, as I mentioned, from the G20. Following the DSSI initiative, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the G20 got together and created what is known as the Common Framework. The Common Framework for debt restructuring and debt negotiation is simply a fancy way to say that all the members of the G20, some a bit more reluctantly than others, agreed that they would coordinate and share information about the restructurings that they would do in the countries that are experiencing debt distress. And in particular, this was a reference to China, because China, not a member of the Paris Club, had been negotiating its debt restructurings privately and bilaterally. And the whole thrust of the Common Framework was that this would be done in a coordinated manner, very much like how the Paris Club does. But At its essence, the common framework, it came out of the G20, but did not have the ownership of all of its members. China's demand has been, that if it is asked to give significant debt relief to the countries that it has lent to as an official creditor, then so should the multilateral development banks participate in the debt restructurings. This is one of the reasons why, for a country like Zambia, it has been 3 years since it defaulted, but even to date, it has not reached a debt agreement because of the lack of ownership in the G20. More generally, the G20 as a forum has become quite fragmented. And the IMF and the World Bank, recognizing that they were not getting much progress out of the G20 to have a faster mechanism for debt restructuring, created what is called the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which is a roundtable that is led by the G20 leadership, the IMF, and the World Bank, and has been meeting periodically to discuss the state of sovereign debt. Now, this is the current international response: the common framework that is not working very well, and the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. And the problems are that, one, the common framework coming out of the G20 is a forum which is very fragmented. It is unlikely and unrealistic, in my view, to think that anything significant would come out of that. And the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable is not a decision-making forum. So then the question becomes, if there is no international, broader forum where decisions can be made or a more efficient restructuring process can be created, then what can be done? And this brings me to my fourth and last area of what I wanted to share with you. So historically, when sovereign debt crises used to occur, there didn't used to be the G20, and there didn't used to be the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. Debt crises have been occurring for 50, 100, more, a number of years. And the resolution of a sovereign debt crisis is really much simpler than the need for a number of these fora. And it's simpler in the sense that what really matters in how quickly a debt crisis is resolved is the lending decision by the lender of last resort. If you have a company that is in debt distress, and slowly its lenders are turning away from it, eventually, if there is the lender of last resort, the manner in which that lender of last resort decides to lend or not to lend to that country to that company will determine what will happen. For sovereigns, this is the IMF. And in my view, one of the ways in which now progress can be made is for the IMF's own lending policies to be reviewed, and for there to be a discussion as to, even if some creditors are reluctant to participate in a debt restructuring, how can the IMF move faster to be able to provide assistance? The reason this is important is because when the lender of last resort, which in our current architecture is the IMF, decides to lend to a sovereign that is in debt distress, it gives a signal to the rest of the creditors that they can now begin to come in, and that distressed country can then reestablish market access. What has happened over the years is that the IMF itself has become more conservative or reluctant to lend into situations where all the creditors may not have been in agreement. And this is not how it used to be the case. If you go and you look at how the sovereign debt crises of the 80s were resolved, a lot of Latin American countries were in debt distress. They were done in a much more rapid way. At that point, the major creditors were big Wall Street banks. The CEOs of these banks sit on big balance sheets and have big egos, not an easy group of creditors to corral and convince them to give a debt restructuring. The then IMF managing director, Mr. De La Rosière, used to call the CEOs of these banks into his office and would simply have a candid conversation with them that went roughly along the following lines, which was to say that the only creditor that is going to be putting money on the table is the IMF. And the only money that is going to be available to service any claims that you have on this country is going to be coming from the IMF. I, as the managing director, am not going to lend a penny to this country unless, before walking out of this office, you commit that you are going to roll over your obligations or give a debt relief in the amount that is needed as determined by the IMF staff. Such a frank and candid conversation used to be enough, and the debt reschedulings got done. So what I am coming towards is that, in my view, one of the ways now to make progress from the current impasse of resolving sovereign debt crises is for the IMF's own lending policies to be reviewed, so that instead of waiting 2 years or 3 years in countries that are experiencing debt distress, it can move in a more rapid manner. This is the same thing that happened in 2011, 2012, when we had the sovereign debt crisis in Greece and a few other European countries. The IMF's lending framework itself evolved exactly to try to get the IMF to respond faster. Now, in this context, let me close then on an area that is often discussed, which is the role of China. Because it has often been said that one of the key constraints in achieving debt restructurings has been that China has not participated in the terms of the restructuring and has been keen to do its deals bilaterally. And to me, this China issue is a lot broader than simply whether or not it's participating in a debt restructuring. To me, what is at stake here is that if China has to make a decision, China has lent about $1 trillion under its Belt and Roads Initiative. And Pakistan, the country that I'm from, in fact, is one of the key recipients of the Belt and Roads Initiative. CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was in fact the first initiative under the BRI. And there are some estimates that of this $1 trillion that China has lent under the BRI, approximately 80 to 100 billion, these are not figures from me, these are figures that are out there, may be experiencing some form of stress. And the question then, to me, that is very, very important, is how would China react once it sees that it is facing some losses? Now, in history, when the G7 countries experienced losses on the lending that they had done, primarily to African countries in the 80s and the 90s, an initiative called the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Initiative was introduced, where these countries, after avoiding the problem for about a decade, were given significant debt relief. In some cases, the debt stocks were halved. But one of the consequences of that was that if you look at the period after the HIPC, the G7 countries stopped giving new aid to the same countries because they felt burnt. For an official creditor, it's very difficult to own up to your cabinet, to your prime minister, or to the parliament and admit that some of the loans that you had done actually need to be written off. The point that I'm making is that China stands at a crossroads. If it follows what has happened with other creditors in the past who have had to give debt relief, then its reaction would be to curtail its own new lending to emerging markets. And certainly there is some evidence that the flow of new lending from China to BRI countries has slowed. In my view, that would be a missed opportunity, and a far better way for China to address this problem would be to, in fact, become more aggressive, but more selective in the lending that it does. More selective in that not all countries are in debt distress. The chart that I showed you on sovereign ratings shows a divergence. While some countries have, in fact, gotten worse, there are some countries that have gotten better. And not cutting off new lending to emerging markets as a whole from China, in my view, is a key priority, because over the years, the amount of bilateral official assistance to the developing economies has shrunk. And this is a message not just for a country like China, but also other new creditors, such as in the Middle East, that have also experienced stress in some of the countries that they have lent to. So with those thoughts, let me close by just recapping the points that I wanted to convey, which first was that the level of debt right now in the developing world is unprecedented, at least since 2020, when organized statistics have presented. Number two, that we as the international financial community missed this solvency problem in many cases, and there's a parallel to be had as similar to how we missed inflation being transitory or more permanent. Number three, the response of the international community has been in fora that are not really functional, such as the G20, or fora which are not decision-making rules, such as the Sovereign Debt Roundtable, but rather that a greater emphasis can be placed on how the IMF's lending policies can be reformed so it can move in a quicker way to address the debt crises in countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakir. That was an amazing presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, it is time for lunch. I'd like to remind all of you that the departure for the gala dinner will start at 18:30 today, 6:30 p.m., so you can all enjoy the experience at the Bildi Country Club for the gala dinner. Thank you very much for your presence, and a last round of applause for you, the delegates who are here in the room. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.